Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. It's me in the corner. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the second event in our spring series of What Matters to Me and Why. I'm Vanessa Gomez-Brake, the Associate Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life here at USC. So glad to see all of you here, enjoying your lunches. Please feel free to go back for seconds. It's all here for you. So this speaker series represents a creative solution to an important problem in the university setting. It's the separation of intellectual life from the personal or the spiritual. What Matters to Me and Why offers the Trojan family an opportunity to hear from USC faculty and administrators in a different way. Rather than lecturing on just their area of expertise or research, we also invite speakers to share their life journey with us. So once a month, during this Wednesday lunch hour, we get to listen in as they reflect on their values, their beliefs, motivations, and the way their lives have been shaped. So if any of you would like to nominate a member of the USC community to speak at a future event, please visit our website, that's orsl.usc.edu, or shoot me an email. And also visit our website if you want to view any of the recordings of our past speakers. Dean Roxworthy was our speaker last month. Amazing story with visuals. That'll be up on our channel here soon. I highly recommend it. So before we begin this main program, I'd like to highlight a few upcoming events this semester, but also offer warm wishes to those of you who are fasting today or observing the Christian holy day of Ash Wednesday. On this day, may we all be reminded that none of us are here forever, and that we too will return to dust. And as I woke up this morning, I am not a Christian, but I do align with that sentiment of returning to dust. And so I thought of this, one of my favorite quotes from the astronomer Carl Sagan. He famously said, "The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself." So yes, may we be reminded that we came from dust, that star stuff, and to dust we shall return. So for a few announcements, we got some great events coming up, and one I definitely want to highlight, and if you came in this way, you would have seen this flyer. Next week, we have the Vigil for Victims of Anti-Asian Hate. And as you may have learned, the Asian and Pacific Islander Faculty and Student Association formed in the wake of the Atlanta shooting last March. And so between APIFSA, APAS, as well as the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life, we really want to build a safe space for all of us who need to find comfort and support from one another. And so this anniversary of that tragic day is this month of March. And so we invite all students, faculty, staff, and community members to join in this vigil on March 9th. So that's next Wednesday at 5 p.m. And we'll be right across the street where the fountains are. And we'll gather to remember the victims of the Atlanta shootings that occurred on March 16th, as well as recent victims of anti-Asian hate. So I hope to see you all out there. So looking far forward, at the Office of Religious Life, we tend to be on a lunar cycle just because a lot of folks are on a lunar calendar. And coming up for the next full moon, Dean Jim Berklow will be leading another full moon drum circle. That means we're out in the courtyard late at night playing drums together. And yes, you do not have to be a musician to play a drum. So all are welcome. And I believe food is also provided. So it's really a full moon party. And then additionally, probably the last generosity meditation of the semester will happen on March 31st. We'll be out at Alumni Park again, and we'll have about a dozen Buddhist monks who represent a variety of Buddhist denominations who will offer a walking meditation from the religious center to the center of campus. We'll all eat together, and then they'll offer us a bit of a blessing or a teaching, some jewels from their tradition. So please do sign up for our newsletter so you can hear more about these upcoming events, and I hope to see you around. So, without further ado, I hope that you can sit back, relax, enjoy your food. And as you listen in today to our speaker, perhaps consider asking a question during our Q&A portion, which will take about 10 minutes at the end of the hour to ask Viet some questions. Now, to introduce today's speaker, we have a colleague of Viet's, and that is Professor Joseph Boone. He is a gender studies professor in media and gender, as well as a professor of English, comparative literatures, and gender studies. So please join me in welcoming Professor Boone to the stage.
Thank you, Melissa, for this opportunity. I can only begin this introduction with a glib cliche that begins far too many introductions, but one that is perfectly appropriate in this case. Namely, that Viet Nguyen needs no introduction, especially not here at USC. He is familiar to all of us, students, professors, administrators, staff, and any of his many faces. I use the word faces in particular. First, as a scholar and teacher who's been a vital part of the USC academic mission since 1997. Second, as the breakout novelist who in 2015 stormed the literary world with his debut novel, The Sympathizer, which won about every award in the book, including the Pulitzer Prize, and which has since been translated into 31 languages. Third, as one of the nation's most respected public intellectuals whose moral and ethical reminders of our complicity in any number of national and global social justice issues have been featured countless times in the media, most prominently in the New York Times. Like I said, Viet needs no introduction. So much for Viet's public persona. I remember him as the bright-eyed youngster, he barely looked 21, who came to speak at the English department as a job candidate fresh from Berkeley in 1995, and won us all over with a presentation, if I remember correctly, on the representations in film of Southeast Asia and their uses of melodrama as a genre. Lucky for us, Viet accepted our eventual offer. I just put that in for you, Viet, given our conversation a second ago, and began his job with a cadre of equally interesting, equally bright-eyed, and equally bushy-tailed assistant professors in various departments who quickly bonded as a kind of posse, and I don't know why, occasionally like to include me in their outings and social gatherings. Being several unmentionable years their senior, I felt rather like their mascot, a little pet mascot that they allowed to tag along and hang out with them. So first I got to know Viet as a friend. I graduated from mascot to friend, I think. Then, as chair of the department in 2003, I officiated over his promotion to associate professor, successfully retaining him in face of a couple of other job offers he received the same year. And along the way, I think we bonded in part because we at least tacitly understood that the other nurtured creative writerly urges that fell outside of our strictly academic job descriptions, and we, again, tacitly encouraged each other to keep our efforts going in those regards. Now, if the hero, or I should say anti-hero of The Sympathizer, is a sleeper agent, a spy placed in a foreign country to carry out secret missions, so too Viet proved to be the consummate sleeper agent in our department, quietly going about the task of honing his fiction writing skills to the knowledge of few as he overtly continued to fulfill his academic role as scholar. But his cover was blown open forever when The Sympathizer appeared in 2015. And over the next several years, catapulted Viet to international fame. Among the recognitions coming his way in swift succession, so swift as to be breathless if he tried to recite them all, Viet received the prize of prizes, the MacArthur Fellowship, better known in the vernacular as the Genius Award. Now, most professors, should they be so lucky as to get a MacArthur with its very generous allowance, immediately use that money to buy themselves out of several years of teaching so they can get on doing their thing. Not so Viet, to my surprise, who shouldered on in his teaching duties as well as becoming chair of the Department of American and Ethnic Studies. Continuing to represent USC as an award-winning teacher and mentor to numerous grad students, he's gotten awards for all these things, Viet meanwhile solidified his reputation, swiftly following his first novel with his second breakthrough scholarly book, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam in the Memory of War, which was a finalist for the National Book Award for nonfiction in 2016. A breakthrough book, to my mind, not only because of its analysis of the way we remember and memorialize war, but because he broke out of an academic style of writing, infusing his account with a narrative fluidity and personal voice that makes it an outstanding example of creative nonfiction as well as cultural criticism. Next followed the publication of his short story collection, The Refugees, many of which he had written in the years prior to this sympathizer as he was honing his, on the sly, his creative writing skills. And most recently, in the 2021 sequel, sorry, I'm stuttering over my words here, in the 2021, the sequel to The Sympathizer, the even more ironically titled The Committed, which appeared to equal acclaim. Now, if the genius of The Sympathizer, the first novel, both titles are deliciously ironic, The Sympathizer, The Committed. In what way are you committed? What's a sympathizer? In various vernaculars. If the genius of The Sympathizer resides in Viet's ability to take a known popular genre, the double agent spy novel, in the mode of, say, a lot of work of Graham Greene, and make it a deeply psychological, dizzyingly postmodernist, ambivalently sympathetic account of its first-person Vietnamese narrator who finds himself split between countries, allegiances, and identities. The parallel sleight of hand in The Committed is to take the popular form of gangster, what I call mob crime fiction, think The Godfather, and transform it into the springboard for a much larger exploration of the narrator's continuing struggles of identity as he finds himself caught up in the violent world of drug trafficking in Paris, and as he is forced to reckon with his own internalization of France's multiple colonial legacies. Get ready now for the final turn on the story of a man with two faces, as in The Unfinished, the final novel of the trilogy, our hero, anti-hero, returns to the United States in the 1980s to face an unknown son, atone for his sins, and seek revenge, if revenge, that is, proves compatible with atonement and the claims of family. Given this summary, you might think that all Viet Nguyen does is right. I don't want to leave you with that impression, though, for it's far from the truth. Viet is a bon vivant who loves living life to its fullest. Case in point. About a decade ago, both of us found ourselves in India to attend one of those mythic multi-day wedding ceremonies, and we were both spending time in Goa just before the wedding. It was New Year's Eve, and while I stayed behind in my lodgings to nurse an incipient cold, Viet and his wife Lon, also a professor here at USC, were among the hundreds of thousands celebrating New Year's Eve on the beaches of Goa, a world-famous party destination, dancing their way from one outdoors club to the next for the whole night. And long ago, Viet taught me the pleasures of a fine whiskey, preferably sipped while reclining in a hot tub. And COVID quarantine has made him an expert mixologist. His French blonde cocktail, I recently discovered, is a golden glory of a drink. In a word, everything Viet touches turns to gold. Let's now see that alchemy at work as he talks to us today about what matters to me and why.
Well, thanks so much, Joe. That was the kind of introduction that only can be given by someone who's known me for 25 years. I remember when I came here, it was 1997, not 1996, not 1995, gave my job talk, and Joe Boone, immediately after I finished, sprang from his chair and came up and talked to me. So I will never forget that. I will also never forget that I was third in line for this job, Joe. That was the English department's assessment of me. So nevertheless, I'm here talking to you about what matters to me and why. And Vanessa brought up the issue of spirituality. And a few weeks ago, unfortunately, the monk Thich Nhat Hanh died. And it's really interesting because I have an 8-year-old son, and Thich Nhat Hanh's writings are so simple in a good way that every night we spend a few minutes reading a couple of pages out of Thich Nhat Hanh's writing, because I'm doing my best to make sure my son doesn't turn into a Catholic like me. But Thich Nhat Hanh, one of the okay, I'm going to offend some people in the course of this talk, okay? Now, Thich Nhat Hanh, one of the most basic elements of his teaching is his call for us to always be fully present no matter what we're doing. And for me, when I'm fully present is when I'm writing. So that's what matters to me. And I'm going to tell you why and how I got to this point. So my origin story is that I was born in Vietnam, and then I came to the United States as a refugee in 1975. And of course, what happened was, with the end of the war in Vietnam, my family turned out to be on the losing side. And along with 130,000 other Vietnamese refugees, we came here to the United States. And we ended up in one of 4 refugee camps. Mine happened to be Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. And in order to leave one of these refugee camps, refugees had to have an American sponsor them. But there wasn't one American willing to sponsor all 4 of us. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, and one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And that's where my memories begin, howling and screaming as I'm taken away from my parents. Now, I was being taken away from my parents for benevolent reasons. My parents needed the time to get on their feet, establish themselves in the United States. But when you're 4 years old, you don't understand that. So I understood that as abandonment and betrayal. And I think I've spent a good portion of my life trying to forget that experience, which I was never successful at doing. That experience has always remained with me, stamped between my shoulder blades like an invisible brand. And when my son turned 4 years old, as I was at that point, it was the occasion for me to look back and reflect upon what that moment had meant to me. And that, when my son turned 4 years old, it was 2017, and this was the time of the so-called Muslim ban in this country. It was also the time when our country, under the previous presidential administration, was detaining families at the border and separating parents from their children. And at that moment, I could look at my son at 4 years of age and see myself as I was at that time, something I hadn't thought about in a very long time. But even more than that, for the first time in my life, I thought about what my parents must have felt to have their children taken away from them, even for benevolent reasons. And I realized that there would be no circumstance in which I, as a parent, could have agreed to having my children taken away from me, if I had any choice in the matter. And then I thought about these families at our southern border, separated, detained, with the possibility of never getting their children back. And I knew that these children and these parents would never forget what had happened to them, that this would traumatize them forever. And so I realized that, once again, our country was doing something that was shameful and something that would be forever stained upon our history and our culture. So at 4 years of age, I was not thinking about those kinds of things. I was thinking about how I should get back to my parents. Well, in fact, I actually turned out to be very lucky because I got to come home after a few months. My brother, who was 10 years old, didn't get to come home for 2 years. And that, he likes to tell me, is how we know Mom and Dad love you more. Oh, don't feel too bad for him. 7 years after coming to this country with no English, he graduates as the valedictorian of his high school, and then goes to Harvard. And then just to rub it in, because I go to my last choice college, he goes to Stanford Medical School, which is what you're supposed to do when you're Asian. Yeah, there you go. So it's obviously not all bad being a refugee. I think being a refugee has given me the requisite emotional damage necessary to become a writer. And I've done my best to pass on that damage to my son. So like many little boys, he loves Legos. I was always asking for Legos. And you know that you should not give your children everything they ask for. You should say no sometimes. So I tell him, no, you can't have those Legos. And do you know why? And he'll think about it for a moment, and he'll say, because you're a refugee? I was like, that's right. I want him to know that both of his parents and all 4 of his grandparents are refugees, because I want him to have empathy for refugees. I want him to be a person who does not turn his back upon refugees, who does not forget where his parents and his grandparents came from. And this is the reason why I call myself a refugee in the present tense, which can seem kind of odd because I have clearly long ago made the transition from refugee to bourgeoisie, from camps to clubs, right? I mean, when I was a college student at Berkeley, I was storming the faculty club. Now I'm a member of this club. It's really weird. We'll get to that. But I want him to know where he comes from, because it's an unfortunate part of the American experience that so many immigrants and refugees come to this country and then decide to close the door behind them. This is actually quite common in the Vietnamese American community, that there are Vietnamese refugees who say, we are the good refugees. These new people coming from south of the border, or these new people who happen to be Muslim or brown or black, these are the bad refugees. Well, I grew up in the Vietnamese refugee community of San Jose, California in the 1970s and 1980s, and let me tell you something. There were a lot of bad Vietnamese refugees, okay? Cash under the table economies, welfare fraud, insurance scams, home invasions. We did it all. So we weren't the good refugees. We were the lucky refugees. And so in my position, I think a lot about who we were as refugees and what we did and how we fit into the American story and how that shaped me as a person and as a writer. And what happened is that my parents in 1978 looked around Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and decided that they were going to move to San Jose, California. Thank God. And they opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, California, which is what you're supposed to do when you're pursuing the American dream. So it was kind of a shock for me to walk down the street from my parents' store when I was about 10 years old and see a sign in another store window that said, another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese. And I was too young to really understand the import of this sign, and that what this sign really was a story that has been with us in the United States for a very long time. But I think I understood that whoever this person was who wrote this sign was thinking of people like my parents. And this person who wrote that sign and put it in that window did not know that my parents, with this grocery store were working 12 to 14-hour days every day of the year. And this person who wrote that sign didn't know what my parents had been through to become the people that they were and to open this store. And this person did not think of my parents as human beings. And so that time on Santa Clara Street in downtown San Jose has been so incredibly formative for me, because I got to see up close what my parents had to go through. You know, my parents were born in the 1930s in Vietnam. It was really another world. They grew up in French colonialism. They survived a famine in North Vietnam that killed 1 million people. They were refugees in 1954, going from North to South Vietnam soon after they married as teenagers. They built a fortune for themselves in South Vietnam, and then in 1975 fled again as refugees to the United States, losing almost everything, and then rebuilding their lives. And that was what I witnessed in the 1970s and 1980s. My parents were also very devout Catholics. And you have to understand something. Vietnamese culture is highly repressive. Catholic culture is highly repressive. So Vietnamese Catholic culture is incredibly repressive. So I grew up, on the one hand, deeply repressed. And on the other hand, watching my parents turn that repression into something really quite wonderful. Because I watched them suffering and striving and working and doing everything in order to provide for my brother and myself, but also for everybody else back in Vietnam. Because in the 1970s and 1980s, Vietnam was starving. And so my parents were sending home money and goods and everything like this to keep all the cousins and uncles and aunts and grandparents alive. And that was what I was witnessing. And it's been enormously motivating when you talk to me about what matters to me and why. It's watching my parents do all of this. And even though I turned out an atheist, I deeply respect the fact that my parents were not hypocrites. They did what they said they were going to do. And I think that's been enormously motivating for me, this Vietnamese Catholic tradition, and watching what my parents went through. Because when I think about my life as a writer, you know, writers complain a lot. We complain an enormous amount about how we're neglected, how we write and no one cares, and all this terrible stuff. But you know what? None of it matters, I think, when I compare what my life is like versus what my parents went through. So it helps to keep things in perspective for me. Now, that sign in that window, another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese, I think probably the worst thing about that sign is that I internalized that sign. So a few years later, when I was 13, I would go to high school. And I went to the most elite high school in San Jose, California. It was a mostly white high school, but there were some of us in that school who were of Asian descent. This was 1984 through 1988. We were of Asian descent, and we knew we were different in some way from the white majority of our school. We just didn't quite know how to put it into words. So every day at lunch, we would gather in a corner of the campus, and we would call ourselves the Asian Invasion. That was the only language we had for ourselves. And the irony of it all is that Asians have never invaded the United States. If anything, the United States has invaded Asia. If you think about the fact that the United States has fought wars in the Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Korea, if you include the Pacific Islands like Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, if you think about the fact that the Orient, broadly construed, originally meant what we call the Middle East, and therefore what we have done in Iraq and Afghanistan are also wars in Asia, this is why so many of us are here in the United States. It's not because of the American dream or the immigrant narrative, it's because wars were fought in Asia and produced the conditions for refugees like me to come to the United States. That matters to me also. So, Asian invasion. I didn't have a language to make sense out of myself and my experiences. I grew up as an American, watching American movies, listening to American music, wearing American fashion, eating American foods, and yet I had these constant reminders that other people would look at me and people like me and not see me as an American. So for example, I was a war fanatic. I was deeply curious about the war that had brought me to the United States, and I was obsessed with American war movies, and I rooted for the Americans. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, Hollywood fought the Vietnam War all over again in movies. And I watched almost all of the movies that Hollywood made about the Vietnam War, which is an exercise I recommend to nobody, especially if you're Vietnamese or Asian. So when I was about 11 or 12, my parents brought home a VCR, very cutting-edge technology, and after I watched Star Wars Episode 4 and the Bruce Lee movies, I watched a movie called Apocalypse Now. And I was rooting for the Americans up until the moment the American soldiers killed or massacred Vietnamese people. And at that point, I was split in two. Was I the Americans doing the killing, or was I the Vietnamese being killed? And I didn't know how to process that feeling. I felt myself split in two, didn't know what to do with that, put it away, didn't think about it until I went to school at Berkeley. Went to school at Berkeley, stepped foot on the campus, and I was immediately radicalized. I became an Asian American. I'd never even heard this term before until I got to Berkeley. And in one of my Asian American Studies classes, the professor asked us to recount a movie scene that had been important to us. First thing that came to my mind was that moment in Apocalypse Now when the Americans massacred the Vietnamese. And as I'm recounting this scene to my classmates, I find myself shaking with rage and anger. And this was the moment when I realized for the first time that stories didn't just have the power to save me, which I already knew, because I dealt with being a refugee and watching what my parents went through by running to the library and escaping through books. So stories saved me. But this was the first time where I realized that stories could destroy me as well. So I began to fully understand the complexity of stories and narratives like Another American Driven Out of Business by the Vietnamese. That narrative has justified anti-Asian violence in this country from the very first moment that Asians have arrived in this country. And anti-Asian violence in this country, what you are going to be talking about, what we have all hopefully noticed happening in this country, one of the important things for me to point out is that the greatest acts of anti-Asian violence is not just what's happening here in the United States. The greatest acts of anti-Asian violence in the American context are those American wars in Asia. And in Berkeley, I started to be able to put those connections together. And so I started to think of myself as a writer. Now, as a young boy, I had already started writing. So for example, in the 3rd grade, I wrote and drew my first book, Lester the Cat. Lester is a cat, stricken with ennui. And bored with urban life, he runs off to the countryside and falls in love with a girl cat. So I was already, internalizing heteronormativity. All right, it's true. So the public library in San Jose gave Lester the Cat a book award, which was so encouraging, and set me on the road to 30 years of misery trying to become a writer. So I went to Berkeley as an English major, and I became an English major because reading was the only thing I was good at, okay? And I loved reading things like Jane Austen and the Romantics. Nothing wrong with Jane Austen and the Romantics. But I found it impossible to go home to my Vietnamese refugee parents working all day in a grocery store and saying, hey, Mom and Dad, I want to spend my life studying Jane Austen and the Romantics. But going to Berkeley and becoming an ethnic studies major in addition to being an English major and reading African American literature, Chicano literature, and Asian American literature, and Native American literature, that allowed me to think that art and writing didn't matter only in their beauty, in their art, but that they could also speak to the conditions of my life and the life of my parents and other Vietnamese people and other Asians and Asian Americans and people of color in this country. So it was an enormously formative intellectual moment for me to be at Berkeley and to think about the possibility of writing both as a form of art, but writing as a form of political and social engagement and intervention as well. And what I was thinking about was what Muhammad Ali said, writing is fighting. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to fight through my writing. I thought back to what had happened to me in the 1970s and 1980s about how the only kinds of Asians that I ever saw were these racist caricatures in television and movies. And I never encountered any Asians or Asian Americans in books until I got to Berkeley. And I thought about how I could just turn on the radio in the 1970s and 1980s and hear some radio DJ make ching-chong jokes on the air. That was everyday life for Asian Americans when I was growing up. And I realized that what I and other people like me, Asian immigrants, Asian Americans, but also lots of other peoples of color and other so-called minorities in this country have experienced when it comes to stories is narrative scarcity. That's when almost none of the stories are about you. And if you are a part of a so-called majority, whatever that is, it doesn't have to be just racial, you live in narrative plenitude. Almost all of the stories are about you. So, when a story about you comes out, and it's not a good story, a bad representation, you can just walk away from it. I have some students, for example, when I show them a movie, they'll say, oh, it's just a movie. They can say that because almost all the movies are about people like them. But when almost all the movies are not about you, and then a movie about someone like you comes out, you get very excited. So when Crazy Rich Asians came out, all the Asians freaked out. Like, oh my God, here's a movie about us. Too bad it's not a very good movie. Doesn't matter, it's about us. So, I always felt this conviction that to be a writer, for me, is an important task. Partly because of the beauty of art, but again, partly because I want to intervene in this narrative scarcity, which I realized eventually cannot be done solely through art. I mean, we need our writers and our artists to create the most beautiful, powerful works of art they can, but narrative scarcity cannot be defeated purely through art. In order to achieve narrative plenitude, you actually have to do things like engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion, all this, who's in control, who's in power. We have to change those behind the scenes elements as well. And so that's why for me, when I was at Berkeley as an undergraduate, being an English and an ethnic studies major was so important because English was about the art and the writing. Ethnic studies was about power and understanding that you cannot actually change things like narrative scarcity to narrative plenitude without having power. And so that's why for me, what matters to me when it comes to this world of writing is not only to write books, but also draw our attention to how art and writing and narrative and stories are embedded in all of the social and economic inequalities and opportunities that characterize our entire society. So, I decided to be a writer when I was at Berkeley, and I got into a class with a teacher named Maxine Hong Kingston, who in 1991, when I took the class when I was 19 years old, was one of the most famous writers in the country. So I got into the class, 14 students, very, very lucky, went to class every day, sat about 5 feet away from Maxine Hong Kingston, and fell asleep every single day. So when you want to talk about what matters to me and why and how I got to be where I am, you have to remember the origin story there, So that's why when I look at students and I see them falling asleep in my class, I don't get upset. I'm like, that could be me, a future me there. We don't know how that person's going to turn out in 30 years, right? I have hope, even for the students who fall asleep in my classes. And now I'm editing Maxine Hong Kingston's volume for the Library of America. She's forgiven me. All right. So that's when at Berkeley days, that's when I really started to get serious about trying to become a writer. And so I started to write. I started to write short stories, The Refugees that Joe mentioned. In fact, when I got hired at USC, this was 1997, I had a summer before I really had to start teaching. And so I spent the summer in Silver Lake, in my first apartment, on a very hot summer, writing a short story collection. I wrote the entire short story collection in one summer. Now, it sucked, but nevertheless, it was words. And that's so crucial. To be a writer, you got to put words on the page. It doesn't matter if it sucks. It will always suck, but you have to put the words on the page. So 1997, I began The Refugees. Do you know when I finished it? 2017. If someone had told me in 1997 that it would take 20 years for me to publish that book, I would never have done it. Never would I have done it. So how did I become a writer? I became a writer because I'm very stubborn. I'm very persistent. From 1997 to 2017, there were so many moments when I could have stopped. So many rejections that I accumulated. So many moments of despair. So many moments of incomprehension from other people. And I think what happened was that I remembered my parents. I remembered everything they had been through and how they never, ever gave up. And they did that doing what they cared about, which was building a business, because they were born dirt poor. And that's what they wanted to do. I had the luxury of what they gave me, so I wasn't poor. But what I wanted to do was to change our country through changing our story, by writing my story. So that's what carried me through 20 years of being the sleeper that Joe was talking about. And I think back to my Berkeley days, there were a lot of writers that I knew at Berkeley who were more talented than I was. Not too many of them became published writers, as far as I know. I did, because I was stubborn and I was persistent. And that is one of the greatest lessons I have to offer, at least if you happen to be a writer. If you are given a choice between talent and persistence, pick persistence, right? Because if you put in your 10,000 hours, as I have done, sitting in a room alone, facing a white wall, you will become a writer. I can't guarantee what kind of writer you're going to become, but you will become a writer. And 10,000 hours alone in a room, that's not too bad if you're in Western Massachusetts, as I just came back from. It's snowing, you got nothing to do, but 10,000 hours in California? Oh, that's hard. That was really, really challenging. So I have the fairy tale story. I did my 10,000 hours, and after all that neglect, I wrote The Sympathizer. It came out. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And winning the Pulitzer Prize is kind of awesome, I have to say. It's like getting a gigantic plate of cocaine for free. Feels real good. Probably bad for you. So one of the indicators of this was that when The Sympathizer came out, something happened that I knew was going to happen, which is that there was a major review published of this novel. And the review said, Viet is a voice for the voiceless. And I thought, no! Have you ever met any Vietnamese people? We're really, really loud. It's not that we're voiceless. It's that we've been silenced. It's that people don't want to hear. And so this idea of being a voice for the voiceless, I'm sure you've all heard it. It's been applied to people before me. It will be applied to people after me. It's actually not a compliment. Because what it really means is that other people only want to hear one voice, rather than that narrative plenitude of that huge diversity of voices that comes from any community that you can imagine. So that's why I feel my task is not to be a voice for the voiceless. I feel that my task, in whatever way I can do it, is to try to abolish the conditions of voicelessness. That's really what matters to me, and why. So I will wrap it up here. I know we have to have time for questions, if you so wish. I am here for you, I guess. Yeah, so, if it was evening, I would say, if you don't have any questions, I'm going straight to the bar. Unfortunately, can't say that here. Probably wouldn't land well. President would be unhappy if I said stuff like that. But yeah, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Viet. Let's have a round of applause, because that was amazing, actually. And we still have about 10 minutes, so I promise to pass the mic here. I already saw my first hand up, but be sure to put your hand up here in a minute, and I'll be sure to get you the mic. But so a student I know, Justin Barnoa, he could not be here today. He preemptively emailed me a question for you. And so he's half Vietnamese and half Guatemalan, both parents refugees. And so, of course, your story has really spoken to him. And similar to your own parents, his parents started a business upon arrival here. And he aspires to speak Vietnamese fluently in his future. And I think, like many Asian Americans, knowing the history of this country and his parents' countries, he's interested in decolonization and what that means for him as an individual as well as an Asian American. So I think the question is about decolonization, but where he brings it is to language. And he said, would you ever want the Vietnamese language to revert from a Latin alphabet to its own character system? Would there be any benefit?
Well, when I came to the United States at 4 years of age, I was fluent in Vietnamese. And all these decades later, I'm still fluent in Vietnamese at a 4-year-old level. So, it's an interesting question, especially around decolonization, because the French came and then, they implemented the current alphabet that we have. I mean, a Portuguese missionary originally invented the alphabet that we use, but it obviously bears the features of Romance languages and has lots of accents in it that look like the French accents and so on. And so the French forced us basically to adopt this system, and then ironically, of course, some of us decided to use the French language, or not both the French language, but also our Romanized Vietnamese language, not only to assimilate better into French culture, which some of us did, but some of us also used those languages in order to foment revolution against the French. So I think one of the things to take away from this is that it's very difficult to think about the world in black or white, in any kind of way you want to think about a binary. Because thinking about the world in a binary is how we have colonization in the first place, the West and the rest. And thinking about the world in the binaries is how we have counter-revolutions, the rest against the West. And while that may be great in terms of national revolutions and independence, it's also not so awesome in terms of the fact that whatever side you're on, atrocities and suppressions happen because of binaries, because we don't want to acknowledge the gray zones, the hybridities in between. And the sympathizer is very much about that. So the project of decolonization is, I think, incredibly important, but in terms of purity, it's a dangerous illusion. Because if you go back before French and the Romanized alphabet of the Vietnamese, you know what we had? We had Quốc ngữ, which is Chinese. So, where are we going to decolonize? I mean, the Vietnamese people actually hate the Chinese more than they do the French, the Japanese, or the Americans. So to think about de-Frenchifying ourselves, if that's a term, but going back to the previous one, which is Chinese, that just introduces us into 1,000 years of Chinese colonization. So you see, I don't know where that pure moment is that he might be asking about. So for me, sometimes people ask me, do you write in Vietnamese? And I'm like, you have not even read my works or my biography or anything, but they'll ask me, do you write in Vietnamese? And in fact, I've thought about it because I thought one of the ironies of my situation is that I write in English, mostly because I have no choice. But I write in English, and it's given me enormous opportunities. This language of English, which has been used partly to justify enormous amounts of colonization, brutalization, dehumanization, is also the language of our liberation, or my liberation. So where's the purity in that? My only route to decolonization is through the way by which I've been colonized. And in fact, if I was writing in Vietnamese, the irony would be that very few people would read me. So writing in the colonizer's language has given me the capacity, and as an American writer, in the heart of American empire, it's one of the reasons why The Sympathizer is translated into 31 languages, because people pay attention around the world to what is written in English by Americans and in other languages by other colonial or formerly colonial powers. A Vietnamese writer in Vietnam would find it extremely difficult to be translated into 31 languages. So, yes, to decolonization, but what does that actually mean? It's not a search for purity.
Thank you for sharing your why. I'm also a refugee, and I wanted to share a story with you and then ask a question. The story is, I grew up in South Louisiana, and I don't look Vietnamese, but because I was not clearly white or black, people thought I was Vietnamese. It was not uncommon. I thought you would find that amusing.
I do.
And my question for you is, when you said that writing is fighting, channeling your inner Ali, you mentioned writing, but I assume that you think art can be fighting and performance can be fighting and nonfiction can be fighting. I wanted to ask you about specifically fiction. What is the power of fiction as fighting compared to every other form of expression that could also be fighting?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that all forms of art can be fighting. For me, I think the power of fiction is its basis in narrative, in telling stories. Now, all those other forms can tell stories too, right? But fiction, for the most part, it's utterly based in storytelling. And so it has the power to get us to identify, put us into situations that we may not have been exposed to in real life. Its basis is also in empathy, right? And so there's a lot about how empathy is important, et cetera, that kind of thing. And it has a capacity to help us imagine other realities, sometimes just on a very small scale, just the intimate realities, and sometimes on a very great scale, utopian possibilities or different kinds of social arrangements. And I think those are all important, because oftentimes a lot of discussion is said about, literature as empathy can establish you in relationship to a group that's really different. That's important. But sometimes you have to think about how, it's hard for us to relate even to the people right next to us, our parents. That requires empathy to engage with our parents, for example. And so, literature, as fiction, allows us to do things that perhaps certain other forms can't quite do. They have other strengths, but I think literature can transport us into other worlds and other possibilities. Certainly that's what I experienced when I was a little boy going to the San Jose Public Library. Now, one thing I'll say is that empathy, while an extremely important emotion, is also kind of illusory, because just because we feel something for somebody in literature or elsewhere doesn't mean we're actually going to do anything about that. And that's one of the dangers of literature, is that it can give us the illusion that simply because we feel something has changed, when out in the world nothing has changed. So that's why I stress that relationship between being a voice for the voiceless in a literary sense and abolishing the conditions of voicelessness, taking action to do something about that kind of voicelessness.
Viet, I loved your comments about narrative scarcity. And certainly for you as a writer, you have a great platform to be able to contribute to the telling of stories that are not, about you. And that the narrative plentitude, I guess, is the opposite. For others, do you have any tangible or practical advice for how we might be able to contribute to that issue of narrative scarcity? You mentioned DEI programs, but I'm interested for what your advice would be.
Well, I think that at the basis of much of what I've been talking about when it comes to storytelling and narrative is the fact that it requires a teller and requires an audience. So yes, I have some advantages there in terms of who I can reach, but I think about how sometimes I'm quite terrified in giving these kinds of talks. This is kind of a home field advantage here. But, for example, I've given talks at the State Department, West Point. My agent says, the CIA is interested. I'm like, really? The CIA? But if the CIA invites me, I will go and talk to the CIA. You know why? Because it's one thing to talk to a friendly audience is another thing to go talk to an audience that might be skeptical or even hostile. And yet, if we want to change the story, the grand narrative, that's exactly what we have to do. So I think about the fact that that's something that we all have the potential to do. To be the teller of our own story, of what we imagine our communities to be like, what we imagine the country or the world to be like, and that we have to bring that story wherever we need to have it told, whether it's at the dining table with extended family, or whether it's in local communities where each of us has the capacity to make an intervention as a member of some community organization, either joining one or starting one. So for example, long before I was an author, I started my own blog called Diacritics, which was paid for by nothing, it was free. And I used that as a platform to invite other Vietnamese diasporic writers to come and publish whatever they wanted to publish. And from there, now 15 years later, Diacritics has a paid staff. It publishes authors who've gone on to publish books and things like that. So I'm just using this as an example for how there's nothing standing in your way of making that intervention into narrative plenitude, whether, again, with existing organizations or creating ones that will address things that are not being addressed. And so I looked around, when I was in college, and my friends and I were like, well, Vietnamese people, we're just being maligned in popular culture. We have to start our own arts organization. We did that in college, and now 20 years later, that organization has changed and grown and changed names, but now it's a 501c3 with a $300,000 budget, So my feeling has always been that nothing is holding us back. We start small, we put in the seeds, it will grow. I'm old, okay? So, but when I was 20, I thought 26 was old, right? But you plant the seeds now, and then 10, 20, 30 years later, something will change. And so you have to have the long view of things in terms of changing our country. Last thing I'll say, the reason why it's important to have the long view is because if we look back upon American history and we go just addressing this question of anti-Asian violence, we have to realize things were pretty bad 150 years ago or 100 years ago. We have to remember that here in downtown LA in the late 19th century, 19 Chinese men and boys were massacred by a mob of 500 people in downtown LA. If we had not done anything at that point, we wouldn't be where we're at now. But Chinese immigrants were already trying to fight back at that point and helping to lay the foundations for organizations and activities and things that we have now that we take for granted. But that wouldn't have happened if people hadn't started small and grown these things over time.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have today. I think some of us have to get back to class and other meetings. But on behalf of the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life and the University Club, I want to thank all of you for being here today, and especially Viet Nguyen for being our featured speaker. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.